So if you remember, sort of earlier in the semester, our general, somewhat open idea was to take motion capture data and map it to sound in some way. Originally, we were sort of thinking of trying to really make the body feel like an instrument, kind of as a result of the tools we're using, and then also just problems we ran into along the way. That changed a bit, and now we've sort of come up with this sort of sound installation thing where we're mocapping a person as well as bots here, and encouraging you to sort of explore like a physical sound space. It's somewhat, I think, inspired, like after Paule Dahlstedt visited, he was sort of talking about like higher dimensional spaces, and he also had his like Connect performance sound thing. So it's slightly similar to that. We're definitely sort of thinking about higher dimensional space as far as like your spatial relation to the box and your body. But yeah, it's sort of this exploration sound-based thing. Some of the tools we're using, so we're taking the motion capture data and we're feeding it into a machine learning software called the Wekinator, which then we are feeding outputs from that after they're trained based on some different trainings that we've done ourselves into our sound synthesis model, which consists of some like granular synthesis.
So I don't think we covered granular synthesis during the sound section. So sort of at a very basic level, granular synthesis is sort of taking a like maybe long sample of a sound and then just zooming in and playing back a certain like grain of that sample. So it might just be playing like 1/8 of a second within that sample and repeating it at like audio rate. So then it's sort of like just taking the waveform from the sample. But then there's a lot of parameters you can play with where you like go between audio rate and then like listening through the sample. So we thought that'd be like an interesting soundscape to explore spatially. I don't know, a lot of the parameters just feel like they naturally work with space, like window size and like, so how big the sample you're actually taking for the granular synthesizer, as well as like where in the sample. Those feel spatial to me at least, so I thought it'd be interesting to explore those spatially. And so we really aimed for not having a super obvious like, oh, this left arm is the filter or whatever. We wanted to make it like sort of obfuscated but still repeatable. So I think the Wekinator was a really useful tool for us to sort of take this machine learning model of like 15 inputs and do like 20 outputs, and it made it really easy for us. So thumbs up for Wekinator. And that's all I have to say about sound.
Yeah, and then like another consideration was the actual like sound that we decided to use as our like samples for the granular synthesis. So we at first were playing around with the idea of like having a very explicit narrative or like theme to all of the sounds, but we eventually like came to the conclusion that it would be more compelling as just like a sound installation by itself if we didn't really have like a set theme or like narrative. So from there we also had to think about like what sound samples to pick, and so during our like initial testing stages we just kept on using this random like drum loop that Matt had on his computer, but we noticed that like when we were using that sample, a lot of the sounds that the Wekinator produced were very like jarring and like not very nice to listen to. So from that, we were thinking about like what sounds might be more pleasant but also still like interesting. So eventually we settled on like the idea of having 3 different sounds to combine. So you'll hear a combination of harp sounds, rain sounds, and also bird sounds. And so they're all kind of like relaxing and like nice to listen to on their own, but you'll probably hear some like interesting combinations when you're exploring the space, just because of the way the granular synthesis worked out. And I guess the last component of this was like the motion capture itself. So like we had to do a lot of troubleshooting with like making sure that the objects that we created to like track the motion of your limbs would be like recognizable as like distinct objects by the motion capture, and then also just like in terms of getting the data to like feed smoothly to like the code that's processing that and turning it into sound, like making sure that the motion capture data was being sent smoothly so that the sound like turned out nicely, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, so parameters aren't just like jumping back and forth, because the motion capture is really good, but sometimes it just kind of jumps off. Oh, microphone, forgot. I think that's all I just said. Yeah, so we do need a volunteer, perhaps another after the first volunteer, to walk around a space, perhaps pick up an object, nothing too involved.
So you
get to guide the sound that we always
this
do.
around your left wrist and this around your right wrist. Yeah.
It's kind of hard, yeah.
It's probably like this under.
Although getting it tight enough is a bit difficult.
As long as it doesn't fall off.
Yeah.
Okay.
Back to my favorite days.
It's not going to turn out well, but we'll try it. We'll try putting it. I'm going to put it sufficiently far. This is probably not going to turn out well. That's okay.
Thank you for noticing.
Around the box as well. See what's the say also, because of how the mappings work, we sort of work with static positions mostly, rather than like movement that's sort of hard to get moved. We mostly worked with sort of static positions with our mappings, and that get like an interpolation between them rather than like movements, I guess. So if you want to try to like hold different positions, and the box is important. So if you want to move it.
Feel free to use the chair if you'd like as well. It is not motion tracked, but it is an option.
Can I pick up the box? Oh snap. What should I do? Any ideas? Okay, no ideas. Maybe supposed to have no ideas.
Make your leg higher than your arms.
You're like, sit down.
We're not all dancers, Chris.
No, I mean like you can be on the chair, just like lay down. No, fair enough.
You can also just like, if anyone else wants to sort of join you, someone
Yeah,
else
someone wants to
move
take the
box, or
wrist.
someone wants
That
to
might be
take
cool.
just the wrist.
Or just the
that's
left
fine,
side.
too.
You just went over that way, like come closer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
here. It's, yeah, the sound is
Take the box with me. Oh, he likes that, I guess. Here, you guys pass it around actually. See what that does.
I see all similar.
I think that the box is do be careful with the box though, because the motion capture balls can fall off, and that will create problems for us. I think that was an extra one. I don't think that was from there.
I thought that came off the box.
That's not
It's probably out of motion.
Oh, okay.
It's
Just barely, yeah.
This is exactly where I pictured myself sophomore year.
I'm gonna assume those are the words.
Did you guys have any ideas for this year? In particular? Because I don't know.
I mean, you can roll around.
Our main
Just to-
inspiration for the chair was that we did a lot of our like testing just like sitting in the chairs and rolling around because we were busy, but it's also a fun way to explore the space.
It's a different way to position yourself.
Oh, that's cool.
One thing we sort of struggle with a little bit is the fact that height affects the training of a model. So we were a little worried that people who were not our height would change it considerably.
Nice.
Is there any optimal distance or like the position that you guys think about while you were testing?
Distance or composition, could you clarify?
Like within like the distance between what she's wearing and the box?
Oh, I see. I don't know if there's an optimal thing exactly, and it's definitely sort of unpredictable.
I just realized like sometimes it
Yeah.
makes the actual pitch noise and otherwise it's just sound.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to try it? I'll try it. Okay.
You can also split those up between people if you guys like. That's
You want
fine.
wrist to your left side or?
Left.
Oh god.
Yes.
There you go.
Go against the norm.
Swedish birds are the best tone.
Does left and right matter? Like, is it okay if you switch?
I mean, it'll make a difference, but like, you can switch them. It's fine. You can break.
Just like, how big is this person? Like, why is it left and right so far? Oh, you know.
And pose.
I know you guys were thinking before having a choreography set up. What happened with that?
So it's mainly as a result, it's sort of a result of the fact that when we were using this software on my computer, which we found really interesting and compelling to use, and like did a lot of the work that we probably would, like training machine learning models would probably not be in scope of doing in half a semester. So we wanted to use my computer, but like it's really more based on position than off of motion. We considered writing some code to sort of like guess motion, but then we thought it might get so obfuscated that it just becomes like chaotic.
Yeah.
So we thought like if position is really what it's based off of, then installation sort of makes more sense than trying to compose something for someone doing yoga positions, although we did consider it.
nothing like that. Yeah.
I know this was already answered before, but I'm wondering, like, I'm projecting Victorian love story on this, right? Like, what was your thinking? Because it sounds like very clean and intentional, and there's like an intentional distortion. Like, what story did you have in mind when putting this together?
I think we didn't necessarily have a specific story in mind, although I'd say definitely a motivation of choosing like sounds that are something, you know, rather than sort of like entirely abstract electronic sounds, is that it feels a bit more personal, and it is possible that someone could sort of project a certain story onto it themselves. But yeah, we didn't necessarily have a specific story in choosing our sounds.
So what about, can you speak a little bit more to like the sounds that we're like listening to?
Yeah. So again, there's three components. There's the harp, which is pretty prominent so far.
Yeah.
That was partly motivated by that we did want some like very pitched like instrumental type thing, and also that Anya plays harp.
Okay, yeah.
That works.
And then also, I don't know, I guess throughout the process we just had different ideas of what sort of sounds we wanted. Josh was sort of thinking like ocean-y sounds, which ended up as being rain. That's just also a nice like noise contrast to the pitched stuff. And then I don't know, the birds just felt like they
Filled out the space.
filled out the space, sort of. Yeah.
I also think one of the big things we were, sort of what Matt said about not necessarily picking like electronic things, is we did want a juxtaposition of the processing and the sound itself. So it seems like we're getting a lot of like in the space of like actually recognizable harp, but like there are parts of the space which you've gotten a little taste of where it's like mangled to such an extent that it's like you have no idea what it is. So we really wanted to like have samples that allowed that juxtaposition of like these like super weird rhythmic industrially sounding things and a harp. And I felt like rainfall, harp, and birds are peaceful enough.
Could one of you guys, do you guys like know how to like play it? Like you said it was sort of like an instrument. Do any of you like understand the
little
little
bit.
long enough to
So-
There are approximate spaces.
One of your trained
Yeah.
sets.
Yeah.
Here, if I can see the box. I believe we had a particular audio rate monstrosity in this corner.
Somewhere around it's always a little hard.
One of the issues is that we had to recalibrate after our training, so everything is kind of.
Yeah, it's not going to be exactly where it was.
If you guys go farther than that corner, it would all. Like, a little bit more that way. Can I find it? Oh, did it?
I think maybe just listening before it ended up further over.
Yeah.
I mean, definitely like immediately after training, we're kind of able to like replicate things that we expect based on what we did in training. But yeah, I think kind of between the time that's passed where we just can't quite remember everything, and also that because we had to recalibrate all the motion capture stuff and things aren't exactly the same, it's a little hard right now.
This is quite disappointing. I can't.
I think earlier just
I
listening,
did
it
it just
kind of
like an
ended up
online
where
sample,
I
but I was like, we should use
a
harp
bit.
sound.
Okay. Yes.
I'll search.
The search. Even we need to explore the space.
I think there was an opportunity too with like someone who plays the harp, right? To maybe like customize it just like that much more. Even if there isn't like a linear story, but just to try to get some motion to some like pattern that we can recognize a little bit more. Because I understand the ambient sounds being like, okay, let's download a file of a bird, right? Like a bird's great. And maybe, that like being able to customize those sounds that you have control over, so that when you're searching for those sounds, to be both of, right? Like those things that we can control versus the things that we know are just like ambient sounds. Because I'm interested in too in like, one is I am totally not play an instrument, so when someone does, I'm like, you have powers, right? Like, what kind of powers do you have, especially for curating a space?
Here we go.
Oh,
That was a bit of it.
That's not a bird.
no. Back in the 80s.
I mean, also those are definitely influencing the volume of things a bit, so it could be that. Yeah.
Birds, no birds.
You want to turn off the sound and we'll talk about that? Oh, that was a good one.
Yeah. We should have definitely moved the origin that way a little bit, because I think it's like in the wall.
Oh, like this, yeah.
Yeah.
Sort of sounded like Legend of Zelda, like just replicating.
Not intentional, but I'll make it.
That was serious.
No, I felt
Yeah, I can see.
Yay, thank you. You did.
Sorry.
Folks have other questions for them or reactions?
I just really like the effect of like you hear like kind of like over here there's like a lot of rain and birds and there's like this kind of like discordant white noise and then every now and then you'll have like the really nice sounding harp notes like break through. I just think that's a really cool effect.
One of them was really kind of like there were moments where it goes into these really interesting sounds, and it felt like this is an instrument that would be really interesting to like learn to play, and I almost like wanted, I think it was really cool like walking through it how much you could kind of pick up like different portions of this instrument, but part of me is also thinking like the idea of putting an instrument and then having a volunteer play it is different from having like someone who's got experience with it playing it, and I kind of almost wanted to see like what it would look like having spent time learning how this instrument works, like what kind of performance that would look like.
Yeah, it's something we did think a bit about, but I think it came down to the fact that a lot of times we would train it and then like something would change slightly in the motion capture, and then like what we learned of that training, even when we ran the same training over again, we couldn't like
Like the instrument changes.
Yeah, the instrument changes enough that it's like, oh, this isn't necessarily something that we can replicate. Like we could replicate it within the same session, but after that session it's hard to really replicate it unless maybe we had a little bit more control of the space. So I think that's why it like more naturally ended up blending itself towards like sort of an installation style rather than like an instrument sort of.
Yeah, and I think we also wanted to avoid the kind of like super obvious like, oh, like if you move your arms up and down that controls pitch, or like that type of like super noticeable pattern. So we wanted to make it more like interesting to explore, and the type of thing that you could like continue discovering new sounds like no matter where you are, like how long you spend like in the space.
Which made machine learning kind of great for it, because then like if we just tell it like take these input parameters and then like you can twiddle these knobs for us, it's like sure there are certain ways we thought of like setting those sound parameters that would like make an interesting sound, but I'm sure there's some permutation of that like the machine learning model is going to interpolate between that we didn't think about and give interesting results.
I'm definitely thinking a little bit along the lines Sharon was talking about sort of like connotation and narrative, and like, I did want a little more of, I wanted to, I'm filling it a little bit based on the sounds and the fact that there's an object, I'm like filling in, like what Sharon said, this like Victorian romance thing, it's like, oh, that fits it, or, and I wanted, like, for one thing, like the object being a box with writing on it is a little too bad. Like I feel like, oh, what could that object be, right?
We talked a lot about that.
Yeah, what were your...
I think we just came down to like we couldn't think of something we found compelling enough to be like, this is what we want our narrative to be, because like we thought of like one of the ones we thought of was like space, but then it's like we couldn't think of a way to make it about space in a way that like felt like valuable and not like contrived, and also not super obvious, because it's like we were like, what object do we use? We could use the spaceman helmet, but that's like, it's like we didn't want it to be like right off the bat, so it's like, and we couldn't. We were sort of running out of time and couldn't figure out a narrative that really worked.
Yeah, you know, maybe if we had more time working on this, we might try to like see what we can do to really make this space feel like something. I guess sort of like the last group had sort of really created an environment, and then that can also then really tie in with the sound. But I mean, we sort of didn't want to like halfway do that. I guess.
Yeah.
I'm curious what kind of effect it would have if, for example, there was like a black like screen that separates the audience and the performers, especially after you guys like clarified that positioning was how the sound was determined. I think that a lot of the movements that Wendy and Mia start to present was a little, like, you know, it didn't have like the same acceleration as before, but also because like, you know, you're going in front of an audience. I don't know if like Wendy and Mia felt this way per se, but I think it's definitely possible that, you know, you could be a little bit more self-aware of like what positions you would take for yourself and like the extent you're willing to experiment with the sound, but also, you know, not be, you know, doing embarrassing stuff in front of your friends. And I'm curious like what kind of effect that would make, like if there was like perhaps like silhouettes instead of the actual people, and like what the level of experimentation, how that could have changed if you had that disconnect.
Any other questions?
Thank you guys.
Okay, good.